We do have a few ground rules that we're going to have to observe for this meeting. As everyone can imagine, a book that is on white power and the question of genocide and the rising threat of genocide, as this book is, does raise a little bit of issues around who might be joining our Zoom call. We have a waiting room that we're managing as the best we can. We've also disabled chat. The chats will go to the co-hosts. And we have a number of other security options that, if we need to, we can, we'll suspend participant activities, and everybody that's in the room, we would just ask you to hold on for a couple seconds if that happens. But what we're going to do is we're going to, if you have questions, I would ask at the very end, please save them and put them in the chat. And the co-hosts, Professor Chavis and I will read those questions, and then we'll call on individuals for the Q&A. So with the ground rules out there, we are really excited for what for the conversation to come. So Professor Alex Hinton is Distinguished Professor of Anthropology at Rutgers University, where he directs the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights. And is UNESCO Chair in Genocide Prevention. Full disclosure, I was a member of this center in my graduate education, and Professor Hinton was my doctoral mentor. So I might be a little biased in saying that the work at the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights is really astounding and just an exciting place to be. And I'm thrilled to have this connection made to bring Professor Hinton to our community here at George Mason University. He's the author of many books, many edited books, including most recently the one he will discuss today, It Can Happen Here: White Power and the Rising Threat of Genocide in the U.S. He's also the author of recent books, The Justice Facade: Trials of Transition in Cambodia, which was published by Oxford in 2018, and Man or Monster: The Trial of a Khmer Rouge Torturer, published by Duke University Press, 2016. In recognition of his work on genocide, the American Anthropological Association selected him as the recipient of the 2009 Robert B. Textor and Family Prize for Excellence in Anticipatory Anthropology. Professor Hinton is also the past president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, a member and visitor at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton, and a convener of the Global Consortium on Bigotry and Hate, which has run from 2019 and will continue to run through 2024. He is currently completing a book about his 2016 experience testifying as an expert witness at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal in Cambodia. My students are well aware of Professor Hinton's work. I assign him throughout my undergraduate and graduate classes. But this semester, we are really especially excited because we have 5 classes that have assigned portions of his current book. So our students are familiar with your work, and we're really honored to have you here. So with that, I'll turn it over. Professor Hinton, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. I am going to do a screen share here, and I have a PowerPoint presentation that I will be using if all goes well. Hopefully you can see that. But before beginning, I just want to really thank Professor Chavis and Professor Irvin-Erickson for hosting this and creating this conversation for this book talk. And I know in terms of putting things like this together, even with the logistics of security, it takes an enormous amount of time. So I'm really appreciative of that. And I just want to, again, also thank some of the different institutional partners who've put on this event, the Carter School broadly, and then within that, the Mitchell program and the Lemkin Genocide Prevention Program. And I also want to thank Busboys and Poets as well. Anyways, this is an amazing set of initiatives. Mitchell program, as well as the Lemkin Prevention Program, are doing amazing work. And I guess I'll be tuning in the future to hear more about the After the Verdict series. It sounds terrific. I've been aware of the things that have gone on before, And I look forward to seeing future talks, though it sounds like next year at this point. We're Rutgers, we're at the last week of classes as well. Okay, so this, in a nutshell, is my talk for today to sort of introduce you to my book. The ebook is out. The sort of press launch is with the print version, which comes out on June 8th. So I'm not going to do a talk where I lay out a lot of the arguments. I'm going to, sort of frame this more as an invitation to read it and touch on some different things that inform the project. So briefly, the sort of organizing framework is I'm going to talk about a moment, 3 that open the door, 3 hinges to that door, 2 roadblocks, 4 stepping stones that structure the book, a mysterious 4-digit code, a kettle on a stove, and a bird. So that's the journey I want to take you on for about 15 to 20 minutes before we have Q&A. So the moment. So the moment that swung open the door to this project in many ways was Charlottesville. And for those of us who study mass violence, genocide, and for many other people, the language of blood and soil was very familiar to us, as well as many of the different symbols that we all saw in 2017 at the Unite the Right rally, when a variety of far-right extremist groups, ranging from neo-Nazis to white power actors, white supremacists, took to the streets. I expect many or most of you are familiar with this. I won't dwell on the event, but this was really the sort of moment I stepped through the door into this project. And one of the things, themes that informs it well, sort of, was this an exception, which is the way it was framed, or is it symptomatic? And I guess in the introductory remarks, you got some of the answer to my perspective already. And so the book eventually would take on a concern with the rising threat of white power extremism. And these are just a few of the events that took place during the course of when I was writing and finishing the book, from Charlottesville to the Capitol insurrection. Okay, so with Charlottesville, the door swung open. There were sort of 3 hinges that began this journey. The first was a call from the American Anthropological Association, where after Charlottesville, they called for anthropologists to teach about race, since anthropologists have worked on this issue for many, many years. And I decided that I would indeed join other anthropologists and hold a teach-in on Charlottesville. This was actually, some of you may be familiar, people in other disciplines, the American Sociological Association, Historical Association, also participated in this. And so a number of academic organizations were active at this moment in having these teach-ins. So that's the first hinge. The second hinge was the sort of question that I have been exploring in my work on the Cambodian genocide and more broadly in comparative genocide studies and study of mass violence, the why question. And so I wanted to take this question and place it on Charlottesville. And, many people were asking this question. The New York Times reporter, Richard Fawcett, published an article about Tony Hoveder that generated enormous controversy because he was accused of normalizing a neo-Nazi. But he sort of asked the question that, I was asking, many people were asking, why did he take this turn to white power extremism? In the language that we use sometimes in genocide studies, he seemed like an ordinary person next door. He was actually unable to answer the question. And so he wrote, after the controversy, he wrote a second article about, his thoughts and reflections on the controversy. And he ended it with the line, "What makes a man start fires?" And you can see over on the side of your screen, it actually comes from a punk rock album title. So that's one way the Charlottesville why, "What makes a man start fires," became one of the key hinges to the project. The second hinge was these considerations at the time of Trump's presidency and the possibility of authoritarianism, fascism, Many people were using the analogy of, Trump equals Hitler at the time. I was concerned with it about the thing, I have spent a lot of time studying, which is genocide and atrocity crimes, mass violence. But these were all questions that were circulating, and that became the second of the hinges. So the three hinges again: Charlottesville teach-in, the why question, and the question, could it happen here? Okay, two roadblocks. Hopefully no one will encounter these roadblocks, right? That's not a good passage on a freeway, but there were two roadblocks to these hinge questions, if we will call them that. The first one is denial. And Sinclair Lewis, back in the 1930s, as Hitler was rising to power, there were white power groups, the silver shirts modeled on Hitler's brown shirts. There were a number of factors that bear some similarity to the way things looked at the start of the Trump administration that gave rise to the title, Sinclair Lewis, It Can't Happen Here. And in this novel, this is what people were saying. And of course, it does happen there. But more broadly, his book is about the failure of moral imagination to think about the possibility that something like that could take place in the US. Of course, why don't people consider that? Well, it's a complicated question, but certainly one key motif is American exceptionalism. There are different versions and iterations of this idea, but often there's this notion that the US has a divine mandate, it's a special chosen country, and it's a beacon of light that has a responsibility of lifting up people from all over the world. So this was definitely part of the roadblock that we have, I think, to sort of considering the question, can it happen here? And we get this echoed sometimes, and as we did after Charlottesville, people saying this is not America. And as we just saw recently with the Capitol insurrection, but actually there are many examples of it, this is not who we are. So again, so we got it with birtherism, Charlottesville, many other occasions. But denial, the sort of denial is a roadblock in the myth of American exceptionalism. The second roadblock is myopia. And in terms of this, I want to focus in on the hater. So it's a figure, a figuration, if you will. And so after Charlottesville, we all heard the language. People would refer to the supremacists, the racists, the haters, with a notion, haters gonna hate. There's a whole language. And this certainly there's a grain of truth to it for sure, to those characterizations. But it's also a big problem in trying to understand what's going on, because it individualizes. It overly focuses on agency, and that's where you get the myopia, the short-sightedness. So for example, if we're talking about the haters or saying hate is the cause of everything, we lose sight about the discursive dimensions of what's going on. A focus on the individual turns us away from the individual, or to use, what we're all aware of now, people weren't talking about so much at the time of Charlottesville, but by saying, oh, they're a bunch of racists to explain what they're doing, it diverts us from structural racism. So again, this is another big roadblock. So again, we can call this the myth of the hater. So we have denial, the two roadblocks. We have denial with the figure of the hater. We have the myth of American exceptionalism. And these were sort of two problematics that I had to grapple with in my study. So we have a moment, three hinges to the door that swung open to the project, two boulders in the path, and they're what we may call four different stepping stones that structure the writing of the book and the flow of the book. The first is Trump. He is someone who's there from the start to finish in the book, making an appearance in many different ways with many of the different questions that are raised, but the sort of underlying issue of, what is the connection between Trump and far-right extremists? And we saw that perhaps most vividly depicted at the Capitol insurrection, but it was ongoing throughout the Trump administration. So this sort of more broadly speaks to the issue of hate speech, incitement, and I look at a number of the white nationalist and racist dog whistles that Trump would use, including the parable of the snake that he often used on the campaign rally, which is a story about a woman who takes in a snake into her home. The snake bites and kills her at the end, and he would, in 2016, frame it by saying, this is about immigration. So we have the dangerous non-white others coming in and biting the pure white woman, a symbol of white America. So the book begins, first chapter, with the snake, and it begins on the campaign trail with Trump giving this oration, which actually is based on a Aesop fable. The second stepping stone is my work as a comparative, as an anthropologist, but also someone who studied genocide and mass violence, atrocity crimes, both institutionally and as a scholar in terms of research. And so I wanted to bring the knowledge that I had gained to bear. Professor Irvin-Erickson and Chavis mentioned this at the beginning, to bear on the situation in the US at the time. A third stepping stone, and this is a big one in the book, is what we might call the lessons motif. So for example, in the introduction, I discuss Adorno's Education After Auschwitz, and sort of talk about critical self-consciousness. So theoretically, that informs, in terms of critical pedagogy, that informs the book. The notion of lessons of the past, what we can learn about the past, how it can provide some sort of insight into the present. The notion of moral compass, which I'll bring up briefly later, but most importantly, the motif of lessons comes out in the different teach-ins I held. So I didn't just hold a Charlottesville teach-in, I ended up holding a Tree of Life teach-in. And the book concludes in July 2020, when I'm with my notes planning a George Floyd structural racism teach-in, which I did in fact teach last fall. And after the book was published this semester, I've actually taught a Capitol insurrection teach-in and an Atlanta spa shooting teach-in. But with the book itself, in terms of the stepping stones, Charlottesville, Tree of Life, and then the planning for the George Floyd teach-ins. What do you do in a teach-in? Well, the idea, again, is to step behind the headlines, to denaturalize assumptions, to historicize events, and have a dialogue that goes beyond people's opinions about what's going on. And I'm not going to go into the detail. I could spend 20 minutes going over this one slide, but just briefly, it gives you an idea of some of the things we talked about. Race and history, the trope of the hater, Trump's two sides comment in terms of using critical pedagogy to unpack it, and of course, understanding the groups at Charlottesville. So the first chapter after the introduction, the snake, is about this teach-in I held, Charlottesville teach-in. I held another one, actually an entire class on the hater. So I was teaching a class that was supposed to be on genocide, and I revamped it, and the students informally named it The Hater. That was the title they gave to it because it was set and began at echo with Charlottesville and sort of moved forward through time. But it looked at things like who were the groups, it historicized Charlottesville and white power extremism in the US, and I talk, sort of unpacked that. And there's the second chapter of the book is The Hater. And again, it's set in the classroom, in this case, not a teach-in, but a class that went over the course of a semester. The fourth stepping stone are literary strategies, and this is kind of an anthropology. In many academic contexts, it's not something people really talk about, but I explicitly am drawing much of my writing. This was true in Man or Monster and other work I've done on literary techniques. And so, in terms of essay writing, creative nonfiction, part of what people talk about is telling a story that overturns another story. So I mentioned the two conceptual roadblocks. That's sort of the story that I want to overturn in the book. But I also attend to things like journey, voice, stakes, audience, setting, using dialogue, using images and language. You know, in poetry and fiction, you know, the injunction is to show, don't tell. In essay writing, creative nonfiction, it's, you know, tell a lot and show, you know, show a lot and tell some. And so that's certainly what this book does. So as some of the people here, some of the students were reading the book. My students also were reading the book this week. And one student made a comment that I put up here saying, oh, it was like being in a classroom. And to me, of everything, this was actually, you know, I was really happy about this because it meant that I had somehow, you know, to some extent succeeded in using these literary strategies. And indeed, you know, it has a setting. You're in the classroom. There's dialogue with the students. The students are talking, I'm talking, pays attention to voice and includes their voices. And each of these, the teach-in, the chapter on the hater, the book as a whole is a journey. So the book begins in Charlottesville and it ends sort of at the very end with Trump's Mount Rushmore speech and planning for the George Floyd teach-in, but actually at the end, as the book was going to press, they let me add in a mention to the Capitol insurrection in the preface. So I view it as going all the way to the Capitol insurrection, which flows right out of the book. So those are the four stepping stones: Trump, my work as a comparative genocide scholar, the motif of lessons, and these literary strategies. So the mysterious code to crack, the 4-digit code. I'm going to be very brief here because it's good to leave you with a code and a mystery. But this emerged in my Tree of Life teach-in after the Robert Bowers attack on Tree of Life Synagogue in 2018. And on his Gab social media page, Gab is well, there's a long story to it, but a lot of far-right extremists use it. And nobody had heard of it. Now people have heard it more often, but a lot of far-right extremists were using it at the time. And on his home page, his picture profile, he had a radar gun with the number 1488. So this became, you know, sort of a question to unpack. And so in the longest chapter of the book on white genocide, I sort of go through the history of white power extremism and systemic white supremacy, bring it forward into the present. One of the key touchstones is William Pierce, who was a professor turned neo-Nazi, who wrote a book called The Turner Diaries, which the FBI referred to as the Bible of the Racist Right, came out in 1978. It's been read or downloaded, you know, nobody knows for sure, hundreds of thousands, likely millions of times. And it's a real touchstone for many white power extremist groups. But part of the reason you know, I focus on this is that it embodies a white genocide imaginary. And by this, I mean, and this again, there's a whole chapter on this, this idea of white victimization and grievance, and the idea that there often is a usually Jewish-led conspiracy to eradicate and eliminate the white race. And again, if you go back to Jews will not replace us, you will not replace us. They also said Jews will not replace us. And this is the replacement language that dovetails directly with the notion of white genocide. White genocide, if we look at white power groups and social movements, it informs their grievance structure. It's a key frame. It's an organizing principle, and it helps them act. The book also goes back and revisits the snake and looks at it as a white genocide parable, as I suggested before, where you have a white woman who's bitten by the non-white snake and kills her. So again, this is one example of many white nationalist discourse that were evident during the Trump administration and his rhetoric. So again, the longest chapter, perhaps the heart of the book, is this chapter on white genocide. And again, if you see the cover, you haven't figured it out now, right? That's the snake. So that's the key image that structures things. So kettle on a teapot, kettle on a stove, excuse me. And I'm going to go a little more quickly through this part of the talk because I'm near the end of the allotted time. But briefly, this takes up the question towards the end of the book of could it happen here? Obviously, the title of my book directly echoes Sinclair Lewis's novel. But what I've been looking at throughout my study, my project, and as I was writing, was the question, to what extent was there overlap, synergy, parallels between the Trump administration and the white power movement? And there were a lot of connections, and I tell that story in the book. Now, in April 2019, I gave my first talk related to this book, and at the time, actually, it was much more about my testimony at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. But this is a slide I used in April 2019. At the very beginning, I said, how do things look with the, can it happen here question? Trump's not Hitler, but he does have echoes in terms of his ultranationalism, populism, revitalization narratives. We have a genocidal movement, quote unquote, in the heartland. So at that time, atrocity crimes weren't so near, but they also weren't nearly as far away as most people would think. And I noted, 9/11, a 9/11-like moment can change things dramatically in a blink of an eye. Well, we had our 9/11 moment, and we're still living in it, right? The pandemic, economic collapse, broad social movements, a contested election, massive incitement, increased armaments. So for those of us who study atrocity crimes prevention, right, these are the sorts of things that we keep our eye on in other countries. Upheaval, past atrocity, scapegoating, weak buffers, catalyst triggers, and atrocity crime. So again, if you sort of think of the kettle on a stove and you look at 2019, things were a rapid simmer, but by the fall of 2020, things were boiling. I'm not the only one who noted this. I did note it in an op-ed that came out with Project Syndicate called Trump's Helter Skelter, but others were, ringing the alarm bell as well at the time. And we ended up with the Capitol insurrection, and I can leave you with perhaps a controversial and scary thought. I think actually if we hadn't had the Capitol insurrection, things would have gotten much worse. So in a very odd way, we're almost lucky that we had that moment because it diffused what was potentially a massive violent storm that was on the horizon. So the book takes up, could it happen here? And then it concludes with the bird. And the last two chapters take up this idea, can it be prevented? Which I'm not really going to go into in any detail, but I did want to touch, given the After the Verdict speaker series, thematic, that I did, as I said before, have this George Floyd structural racism teach-in, and these, some of the same sorts of things we had looked at before in the Charlottesville teach-in reemerged, except for now structural racism was much more foregrounded. And also it's situated in terms of the Trump Mount Rushmore and fall 2020 political campaign that's focused on long criminality, which directly ties into longstanding notions of Black criminality that date back, to the slave patrols. So I just wanted to make that wave to the thematic and also the moment that we just had with the trial. But I want to finish up by going back to the snake, where I began. The snake in white power and the white power imaginary is also a symbol of Jews, the demonic Jews. It's a symbol of illegal aliens, quote unquote. And as I said, it's also a parable of white genocide. So I wanted to end, as my book does, by juxtaposing the snake to the bird. And by the bird, this is taken from Toni Morrison's Nobel Prize address in '93. And it speaks very much, very directly to the snake and much of the hate speech and incitement that took place during the Trump administration. And again, just, to end with her words, the systematic looting of language, right, fails. And it's sort of what's important about language is it's nuanced, complex, its midwifery properties. And instead of having these, right, the language of power and hate ends up with menace and subjugation. And she speaks of the oppressive language as being a form of violence. In this address, she also notes that racist language, the policing languages of mastery, and I would just add this dovetails with Adorno and the Frankfurt School as well. But what it does is it eliminates the public sphere, and it eliminates the ability to have a mutual exchange of ideas. What's been going on? Well, this hasn't ended by any means, right? Tucker Carlson's talking about the Great Replacement, right? White genocide motif on the air. Marjorie Taylor Greene recently talked about launching the America First project, which would be focused on Anglo-Saxon traditions. There are other examples as well. Lindsey Graham recently said that the problem of race in the US is due to a few bad apples. So this language is very much in ways of thinking, the things I talk about in the book and that were evident in the Trump administration, that in some sense people aren't attending to quite so much, are very much present. And I would say in a different talk that the threat of atrocity crimes remains. We're not at a high boil, but certainly things are still at a simmer. And if Trump comes back, things go back to a boil quite rapidly, I'm confident. So in keeping with Toni Morrison, I want to point out the book at one point has a chapter set at Chautauqua, which is originally a religious institution for Sunday school teachers. And they had I went there for a week with my family, and the theme was grace. And that was the week that the Walmart shooting took place. It was the week that Nguyen Gia died, and it was the week that Toni Morrison died. So the book actually ends, near the end of it, talks about moral compass and sort of lessons learned in this odd conjunction of events. So I want to end with Toni Morrison and the bird, as opposed to the snake, the bird of language and dialogue. She says in the address that the bird is a symbol of language. And she ends, as I want to end my talk, by saying, look, how lovely it is, this thing we've done together, which again is a thing of dialogue, openness, and multivocality, which is the opposite of the snake. So with that, I conclude my brief journey through some of the themes of the book. Like all books, though, I probably shouldn't have that. I should have Toni Morrison come after this. But there is if you're interested in the book, there is a discount, Hinton 30. I did not create that code. That was the publisher. I had nothing to do with it, but you can get a discount on the book. Anyway, so that's, I'm happy to take some questions, and I appreciate your listening to my book talk.
Great, thank you so much,
Dr. Hinton. This was really a pleasure. We have a number of questions coming in. I'm going to ask that people continue to type them into the chat, and then I'll call on you, and I'll try my best to unmute you with the security function, I think. All right, so it looks like I can. All right, this is how it's going to work. So as the questions are coming in, I did want to say is what I thought was the really sensitive and touching part of the book was actually the dialogue and the conversation, the opening lines. For those of you who have yet to read it, the book does begin in a Rutgers University classroom in Newark, New Jersey, and that of course is close to my heart since that's where I did my undergraduate work and my graduate work. So for those Rutgers professors here, it's great to see you, and for everybody else, you get to figure out what it was like to take classes with Professor Hinton. So we've got some questions, and I would like to ask if I'll begin with a student, Christopher Church. If you could ask your question briefly, and then I'll maybe we'll take a couple. But Chris, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Hinton, for joining us and talking with us today. One of the things I found most fascinating about your book is the idea of the sort of the storytelling you used in the book, but then the literary process and how that could be used to address some of these issues. So my question kind of focuses around that. How can we effectively get a new narrative out there that counters the white power narratives? And kind of related to that, how can we get a widespread audience to begin considering this idea of the moral compass and critical thinking, especially in education, given that there's political and social barriers to education that inhibit critical analyzing of genocide and white power subjects?
Thank you. I feel like you should actually give a talk. You just gave a very impressive question. I think we may need a lot of time to discuss it. Great question.
We can take maybe 2 more. Does that sound okay?
Sure.
All right. We have a question from Martha Stroud. What could I ask you to
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for a tantalizing talk. I can't wait to read the book. And I'm sure I'm not alone among the attendees who haven't read it yet. I was really intrigued by your comments about what the emphasis on hate as the cause of everything, the ways in which that diminishes our view of the discursive. And I was just wondering if you could say a little more about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Martha.
And should we do one more?
Let's do one more. Yeah.
All right. The one that seems to me a thread here would be Gregory Stanton. Can I ask you to unmute?
Hi, Alex.
Hey, Greg.
It's great to see you again. Alex and I are very old friends. In fact, we've gone through quite a lot together, haven't we, Alex?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we were the organizers of the IHS meeting in Bosnia in 2007. Still the largest, I think. Anyway, Alex, I just want to congratulate you on this marvelous book. It is a clarion call to America, and I hope Americans will take it seriously. I know that denial is the default position of most people when it comes to these warnings, and genocide is certainly to be worried about here. Genocide Watch, as you know, published a piece in which we pointed out that there were a lot of parallels between Trump's policies and symbolism and Nazi policies and symbolism. And those who would like to take a look at our what we published about that in January can just go to our website, which is just genocidewatch.com. But I'd like you to, if you would, please, in your own words, summarize some of the similarities between the symbols and the policies of the Trump administration and of Hitler's Nazism.
Okay. Anyways, that's fantastic. What 3 great questions. And for the next iteration, I'm going to have to put, I should put your January study in there, which I very much appreciated when it came out. So 3 fantastic questions. There are 3 questions that could take quite some time to discuss. So I guess I'll just go in order and take them one by one. So for the storytelling, sort of what can we do, dialogue, right. So there are a few different pieces to that question. One is a question that I think is centered, one dimension centered on critical pedagogy. And this goes back to the Frankfurt School and Adorno on education after Auschwitz. I think that's part of the theme that was being picked up on. And part of what was going, if you think about it, it's really strange that we had the Frankfurt School pairing up with US psychologists, right, who work in a much more positivistic manner. They joined together in the 1940s, 1950s, and came out with this authoritarian personality study. If I were to ask you and you didn't know anything about about the authoritarian personality study, do you think there's any chance that, the Frankfurt School would work with American US psychologists and the positivistic tradition? You'd probably say I was crazy. No way. But they did. And that's part what's really kind of fascinating. And for this project, it was really interesting to go back and reread through the authoritarian personality, which was sort of dismissed by many. It came back into favor to some extent during the Trump administration, where people were talking about Trump as authoritarian. But what the point of connection was, and here we have a link as well to white power extremists that I'll get to in a second, was that for Adorno, Horkheimer, and the members of the Frankfurt School, who were informed, they were both Hegelians in terms of dialectic, but they also were informed by Marxism as well. And so they were concerned about social forces, structures of power. And what had happened in sort of the context following the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany is they had seen sort of the most extreme forms of authoritarianism take place, and the idea that you could somehow resist that, it seemed really difficult. Fomenting change seemed very difficult for people advocating from a political position. And I'm going to loop around to this again in terms of the public sphere. But what was absolutely critical then, why were they doing this? They wanted to advocate for critical self-awareness, right? So what we are talking about, critical thinking, but for them, it was framed in terms of their larger theoretical backdrop. And that critical self-awareness for them is what would enable resistance to these structures of power. And if you couldn't undertake major political change, you could broadly change society through education. That was the hope. That was the point at which they came together to work together on the study. And if you actually read through the authoritarian personality, and anyone who's interested in teaching, I encourage you to go back and reread it. It's fascinating because the different chapters are written by different people, and sometimes they seem like they're talking about completely different things. But this idea of critical self-awareness in terms of what can we do, right? With the first question from Chris, I believe it was, right, is teaching critical thinking, critical self-awareness. And here I don't talk about Hannah Arendt in the book, but she fits directly. I think her real insight, and again, what was sort of the key thing about totalitarianism for her, it was the erasure of the public sphere, so that it was no longer possible for people to dialogue. And for her, the key movement is that it's incumbent, ideally, for all of us, and this, people misread her on Eichmann all the time, and Eichmann in Jerusalem and the banality of evil. She actually wasn't just talking about desk bureaucrats, and that's usually the way it's portrayed. She was talking about that word that she uses in Eichmann in Jerusalem, thoughtlessness. And for her, prevention was linked to thoughtfulness. And if you read on, she went in the latter part of her career to actually sort of pursue this question, what does it mean to think? And she, in The Life of the Mind, goes back and talks, for those fans of, well, she actually doesn't like Plato, she likes Socrates, about the two-in-one, which is the dialogue we all have in our own minds about different issues as we think. Now, she critiqued philosophers like Heidegger and others for just solely thinking. For her, there was an ethical responsibility to take this thought process that would render judgments and dialogue about them in the public sphere. And again, as I said before, the erasure of the public sphere for her, right, that's the essence of totalitarianism, where people think in terms of cliches, as Eichmann did. It's a time of thoughtlessness. And again, to make I think all of us have this challenge at all times, whatever our political beliefs, but surely at the end of 2020, when we had slogans like "Stop the Steal," "The Big Lie," this sort of cliched thinking that Arendt saw and Eichmann and Nazi Germany at the time, and maybe this also speaks as well to Professor Stanton's question as one piece of it, right, was predominating in the US. along with dangerous incitement. And that incitement, I just want to reiterate, is still with us, the potential for that. If Trump gets a social media platform, we're in trouble. You know, I'll just leave, that's my view. I'll set that aside. And again, if you'd asked me in 2019, I would have said we're still quite far away from atrocity crimes, though certainly that possibility is there. We've entered a new phase of polarization that now exists, and it's a bad situation. So, you know, first question, sorry, I went on so long with it, but this notion of, you know, create the centrality of the public sphere, the centrality of thinking in the sense that Arendt talks about, of critical self-awareness, and the sense that Adorno and the Frankfurt School talked about. Those are all things we can do and act upon, right? So we have a public sphere, we're able to talk, and we can challenge narratives. We can write in different ways. I mean, again, the we is hard because everyone occupies a different sort of position. You know, Professor Stanton's the head of Genocide Watch, so he has a voice that he can really speak to a lot of people, and a lot of people as well in the government, practitioners, for example. But, you know, as I'm trying to do in the classroom, I'm working as well in the classroom, writing an op-ed, that's for me. But all of us are in public spheres, different domains where we dialogue with others. But the key thing is, and it's really hard, right? And this comes back to the moral compass piece of it. It's really hard to dialogue with people right now, right? So I don't know how many of you, I assume many of you have a relative, and I assume there are people from a range of political positions who are here, but you have relatives, you have friends. And the ability to discourse about politics, about race, about the moment we just had is really difficult. You know, so maybe this is where, you know, my anthropological hat, and there are many other disciplines that speak to it as well. The training, you know, with the methodology of cultural relativism, it's a long story to that, but the idea as an anthropologist is you try and suspend your own opinions and listen and understand people in a different context. And for me, a lot of my research was interviewing and talking and meeting with perpetrators of genocide, former torturers, and that's that's difficult. So I have some training with that, but that's that sort of move, and I'm not trying to say people who support Trump are like torturers, right? And this goes left and right both ways, because you have sort of standardized, cliched thinking on the left and the right, but it's the ability to try and understand and listen to the person who has a different view, right? We go back to Arendt, the public sphere. We have our judgments, they have their judgments. There may be more or less the two in one, as she called the Socratic thinking involved, but to be able to have that dialogue. So the moral compass part of the book, and in some ways I probably should have brought the moral compass to the front of the book. It's at the back of the book, and it's specifically in this unit on Chautauqua and in anthropology and many other academic contexts. If you mention Chautauqua, which is a religious institution, you even mention the word grace, you know, people are going to turn away and not listen to you anymore. Well, okay, so I have a whole chapter centered on the notion of grace. I say my own position, you know, I'll say it here, is I'm agnostic. I'm not theistic. I'm not atheistic. I believe in ignorance in the sense that we're all highly ignorant. And to me, that's also part of a stance to try and listen to others, as an acknowledgement of ignorance and lack of understanding. So you can read the book about moral compass, but the idea is grace through dialogues emerge links to the notion of awareness. And again, at Chautauqua, and as I said, critical self-awareness in terms of the Frankfurt School. And it sort of basically looks at the different pillars in terms of orientation, of understanding a context, looking around, understanding a context, looking back, understanding the historical path that led you to this context, empathy, looking at the other people with whom you interact and may disagree with, and being able to dialogue, but it also is a way. Oh, and then the fourth point is foresight, looking ahead. And that's the moral compass that I discuss at the end of the book, and that again, for navigating these fraught times is absolutely critical. It ties into Martha's question on hate very much, because again, the hater, it's easy to see the hater. The book begins, the first full chapter with a thing of me watching on the screen as the hater appears. It probably be a bit strange to read. It doesn't really fit with the rest of the book, but that's the notion, right? I'm interpolated to some extent in these rhetorics as well. I see the supremacist, I see the hater. And again, it's my path, someone who studied these issues a long time, of trying to overcome that roadblock, which is a conceptual roadblock that I play into, right? It's a roadblock of my own, but it's also one that really hinders a lot of discussion. I should note, this last week, a number of the students, like their favorite, sort of the thing they really focused on was actually the hater chapter.
Yeah. Go ahead. Nope, sorry.
I'm sorry, I've been going on too long.
No.
I think I can answer Professor Stanton's question really easily.
Sure.
Which is to say, go look at his stages of genocide and look at his January report, and you'll go through and you'll see everything, including at the end, denial. Yeah. Right? And denial is absolutely critical. And he argues that it's the last stage of genocide. It's the final erasure of the victims through denial. Anyways, I went on too long. I apologize.
No worries. But Dr. Hinton, we had a question really quick. I wanted to bring in a colleague here at the Carter School, Dr. Tahima Lopez Benyazi. Doug, if you can go ahead and unmute her, Dr. Lopez Benyazi, that would be good.
All right, you should be good to go.
All right, hi. Thank you for your talk. I really look forward to reading your book. NYU's putting out a lot of good stuff these days. I wanted to ask, do you conceive of the possibility of genocide in contemporary times, primarily in terms of direct violence, or through more structural violence, such as incarceration, lack of healthcare in a pandemic, deportation, et cetera?
Yeah, what a great question. So yes, both. So I very much think we have the possibility. I don't mean to be sort of playing into fears and alarms, but the Lafayette Square illustrated and sort of set up a path that could have easily led a path like that to atrocity crimes. Like, that's the moment where you had the involvement of military. You had military troops who were given bayonets. Most people don't know that. They were given bayonets and they could have been put on the streets. I mean, that's kind of a really scary thought, but that sort of a scenario could easily have unfolded and still could potentially unfold down the road, especially with the different militias that are allied with Trump. And again, as a sort of aside, it's important to remember Charlottesville, we had the far hard right and we had the alt-right, and you had some militias that were keeping the peace. What's terrifying about the Capitol insurrection is that we had actually the far hard right were there, but they weren't the biggest groups. We actually had militia groups who traditionally have overlapped and intersected with white power extremists who had moved front and center. And they also all like groups talking about Western heritage, and it's sort of complicated, but that bucket had expanded dramatically. We had Christian nationalists and we had QAnon. So the pool of people was much broader who were involved. And what that revealed, right, those groups were there and potentially active beforehand. What that really revealed is that there's a very broad spectrum of people who support white power. Maybe that seems obvious in one sense. We're not talking about 10,000, not talking about 15,000. We're not talking about 150,000. We're not talking about 1.5 million. We're not talking about 15 million. We're talking about tens of millions of people, broadly defined, who sympathize loosely or strongly with white power extremist views. There are polls that came out that, and actually back with Adorno, I became a fan again of the authoritarian personality when I reread it. But they also, their study said, well, 10% of the people in the US have the authoritarian personality. I don't want to get into the arguments about types and different things. Adorno has a really interesting sort of, in the Frankfurt School, of interesting thing about typing. Anyways, it's a digression though. But they said up to 30% of people in the US had tendencies towards the authoritarian personality. So, people can dismiss that as they have a lot of the stuff authoritarian personality. After Charlottesville study was done, they found about 10% of people in the US sympathized with the views of the alt-right actors there. So there are a number of studies through time, and the numbers, now what was implicit, what was unable to be said, can be said, and Tucker Carlson just said it. Replacement is real. It's something that should be addressed. What's his viewership? I want to say, I'm not sure. I believe it's like 5 to 10 million people each night. There are massive numbers of people, and that should make all of us worried. But anyway, so I digress from the question just to come back. So the book, absolutely, we should be talking and considering structural genocide. It's an idea that's been talked about, never really has been unpacked to the extent it should be. And settler colonial studies, Patrick Wolf, different people have taken it up. But it's really, I think, something that needs to be addressed within the field of genocide studies. I take up We Charge Genocide, which was a petition 51, there's brought forth with the, using the UN Genocide Convention to say that Blacks in the US were victims of genocide. And it lays out actually within a very short period of time that's very short. It doesn't actually it mentions history, the long history of enslavement and Jim Crow, but it only talks about the last, I can't remember, 8 to 10 years. And it lists everything. And, you talk about structural racism, go back and read that petition, it speaks directly to the current moment, the way it's written, but there's something there. And I talk about this in the book. And I even say, if you ask most people in, quote unquote, genocide studies, are Blacks in the US victims of genocide? 5 years ago, people would have looked at me as if I were crazy, probably, to even ask that question. Now it's a question that's being asked. Yeah, but I say, yeah, I think it was. I think that but to do that, you also have to go back to the notion of structural genocide. Our understandings of genocide are really problematic just in the notion of endings, for example, and this has been taken up in the last 5 to 10 years as well. Like, what does it mean for a genocide to end? Everybody thinks Holocaust, right? Holocaust ends, that's it, death's over. But as we know from the US experience, of indigenous peoples, for example, that's not how it plays out. It's a long, fraught process. So the way we conceptualize even the very ending of genocide is highly problematic. And it deflects us away from the structural issues that you mentioned in your question. So I take, in the book, I take up We Charge Genocide. I teach We Charge Genocide. And I hope that this becomes an area that there are scholars in critical race studies who've taken this up, but it's the Holocaust prototype still predominates in the field of genocide studies. And that's a big problem because go back to those 2 boulders, right? This is another conceptual blockage and we need to get past it. So great question. Yes, there's a short answer, yes, and a long answer, which I guess I just gave.
All right, go ahead, Doug. You have another question for
All
us?
right, we have 2 students who we're gonna let them cut the line of professors. Sorry, professors. The first one is Susanna Mason is asking me to read this question. So I'm gonna read it and then I'm gonna go to Ajana's question. So Susanna Mason writes, do you, Professor Hinton, think that categorizing the US as a genocidal society as a whole is right or accurate, considering that the US has both victims and perpetrators as part of its society? And Ajane, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself. So you should be able to do it right now.
Hello, thanks so much, Dr. Hinton, for your talk and your book. I appreciate it very much. I want to start with a comment first. My comment is thanks so much for ending your book with the bird and with a Black woman who is a literary juggernaut. That as a Black woman who studies in peace and conflict resolution brings great joy to my heart, particularly because you made it interdisciplinary. You took literature and put it into genocide and took a Black woman and put her at the end of a book about white supremacy and white power. And so I want to thank you for that, first of all. So my second comment comes in, or my second part of this, my rambling a little bit, comes in the form of a question, I suppose. Because you did put a Black woman at the end of your book, a Black literary juggernaut at the end of your book, I am curious how you see Black women taking up Iran's stopping the erasure of the public space, I guess is what I'm trying to get at. How do you view the role or the characterization of Black women as being involved in that space, being involved in taking control of the public space? And then what, as Black women step into that public space, what is the role of everyone else? Because we're talking about undoing structural violence. Black women, as we all know, have been historically at the bottom of every social hierarchy in this country. And so to move us into that public space, what does that look like for everyone else? Thanks.
Oh boy, what great questions. So with regard to the first, I would just say, I would not, even though I probably use the term, a genocidal society, and if it's in there somewhere, I probably would step back. I think it's not good to characterize a society as a certain type of thing. There are a lot of problems that erases complexity, but a society in which genocide, atrocity crimes, mass violence, many awful things have taken place, absolutely. So I would frame it that way. Though again, like with the term the hater, with referring to the people at Charlottesville as white supremacists, there's a big grain of truth to that. It gets at something important, but it also, with those conceptual blockages, can divert us from looking at larger histories, structural forces that are very important. In terms of the role of Black women, Toni Morrison, as I said at the time, and I'll come back to this in 1 second, but she died that week. And it's certainly, I've always been a huge fan of Toni Morrison. I teach the bird in the hand, is how I refer to the story. The Nobel Prize address almost every time I teach about race. At this point, I always try and bring in literature. I wish she wrote one essay about Trump, and I believe it was in the New Yorker or Atlantic. There were a series of essays. I believe it was titled "Make America White Again." But I would almost have liked to have heard her speak out more about Trump. She did speak about him, but everything she says speaks to the moment and those 4 years in which we were living, and we continue to live in many different ways. So Toni Morrison, the snake will be quickly forgotten, but the bird will be long remembered. Maybe we should put it that way, right? Because the snake is a shallow, oppressive, trite literary rendition of, again, taking an Aesop fable and turning it into a political slogan and hate diatribe. where Toni Morrison, her words are read and reread, that literary address. I should note, and if you haven't read it, you can listen to her on the Nobel site, you can read it, but it's great to listen to her as well. It begins once upon a time, first time. Then it begins again, once upon a time, a second time. And then it begins once upon a time, a third time. She subverts her own story to model openness and multivocality in her story. And again, that's something that bears, like all of her incredible work, reading and rereading. But the other event that occurred, and I didn't take this up, I was considering doing more with it at the time, but the book was, I was sort of running out of space. I touch on a little bit, was in terms of the role of Black women, was the 1619 Project. It also was coming out that same month, right? August 2019. That project has broken the ground in all sorts of new ways. And if you have any doubt about that, the fact that we have the 1776 Commission, the 1776 Project, the fact that it's getting so much, right now we have different states, Idaho, I believe a couple of days ago, is banning the teaching of the 1619 Project, right? This sort of carries on, a number of conservative states have done it. But it's like all things, if people are responding to something like that in this sort of way, it means it's a massive, huge, important success. And I believe she just got an award, I can't remember, Hannah Jones, but her work also, in sort of one other little anecdote, I haven't been able to confirm it, but there was I saw it sort of floating by, and I haven't been able to confirm it, that Marjorie Taylor Greene was talking about a 1215 project, right? Magna Carta. So again, and again, follow that up on your own. I can't provide you with the source. I saw this and I've been meaning to go back and track it down. But again, just the centrality of speaking about Jamestown, the history of enslavement, the 1619 has been so incredibly important, and it's going to have ramifications to come. So there you have another Black woman doing incredible work to sort of drive this along. But yeah, I think in your question, I'm sort of looping around it in different ways, but intersectionality is absolutely critical to look at. But the contributions of Black women are both absolutely essential and also remarkable at this moment in history. And there are many others as well. Yeah, so again, a long answer. I hope I didn't go on too long, but I'm happy to take a few more questions. These are great questions so far. Yeah,
I'll turn it back over to Doug. Do we have a few more questions, Doug? Or we have a lot. We might have to invite you back, Dr. Hinton.
we have a lot. We have a lot of questions. We have promised people that we would end at 5. In my experience of taking classes at Rutgers, Professor Alex Hinton had a great rule, which is that students go first in asking questions. So I am going to take some executive action here, because we do have to stop at 5, and apologize to my colleagues on the faculty for not calling on them, but to say that I do think that this is worthy of its own continuation of a conversation, and we can find the forum to do that. I'm going to just I'm going to put some things in the chat. I'm going to put Alex's Twitter, Professor Hinton's Twitter handle, Alex Hinton's Twitter handle in there. And I've got some questions to put the discount code. So that's Hinton 30, correct? That's the discount code?
Hinton 30, but I didn't come up with that. I
was going to say, is that your, listen, you looking pretty.
So, and I will say that, and to follow up on the previous comment about NYU Press, our colleague Tehema's book is just fantastic. And so it would actually be a nice pairing.
Stay woke.
Stay woke. So, so I'm going to turn it over to Charles to do the closeout, and thank everybody again. And I'm going to post stuff in the chat for everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Hinton.
Yeah. Great. I just want to thank you again as well, Dr. Hinton, for this book. I mean, I think it's going to be such a contribution, not only to the field, but to this country. And I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that it gets out, and those involved with any type of decisions around dealing with and confronting systemic injustices in this country should definitely have this book. And so I'm definitely a fan. And I want to thank Doug and others who recommended you for this presentation. And we definitely want you to come back. I know that for sure. And so we will be calling on you very soon to have a more detailed conversation, because we have so many people, questions that we didn't get to. But again, thank you so much, Dr. Hinton. And we are honored and look forward to your next book. So thank you.
Thank
Be
you.
well, everyone.
It's an honor to have spoken here, and I really am such an admirer of all you're doing there. I mean, what a dynamic place.
Thank you. All right, everyone, be well and be safe. Have a great weekend.